Agostino Gemelli and Phonetic Sciences in Europe and around the world in the first half of the 20th century. Just outside the second cloister of Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore stands a very modern pavilion, known to just a few, where the silence of the cloisters is disturbed by the constant hum of the electric current. This is, or was, the kingdom of Father Gemelli, the university rector, who pursued highly original and fascinating research on the psychological analysis of the human voice, a sort of closed, magical world in which the voice becomes an oscillographic curve, revealing to those who study it hidden psychological and melodic laws which give it its human meaning. The Laboratory of Experimental Psychology was founded by Gemelli in 1924 and enlarged in 1929 to include a section on phonetics, making use of state-of-the-art tools. The laboratory was the heart of a dense network of exchanges and was visited by scholars from all over the world. The phonetic research carried out here was technologically advanced and multidisciplinary, and it catapulted the charismatic Gemelli into the international arena, where his persuasive force, solid methods, and vast knowledge attracted attention. His works on the human voice, largely unknown today, became among the most famous in the field from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s. Agostino Gemelli belongs to that class of scientists which was never still and was shaped by the sociability of the university in Europe between 1880 and the First World War. His encyclopedic education and training covered vast areas of knowledge, particularly biology, medicine, philosophy, psychology, and theology. Since the foundation of Università Cattolica in 1921, and until the end of the 1950s, he stood out on the scientific and cultural stage in Italy, notable for his solid international reputation and intuitive, interpretative skills that were ahead of his time. Some of his original traits were his studies in Germany and his strong civic and scientific engagement in two young disciplines, psychology and phonetics, which are nowadays far apart as disciplinary sectors. He was a tireless worker and a pugnacious promulgator of innovative ideas, keen to discuss them with others. The formation of students and other scholars was another important trait, and he held several prestigious positions in education and on the cultural scene. Agostino Gemelli studied under Camillo Golgi, a future Nobel Prize winner in medicine, at Pavia University, and he acquired his scientific method. Another student of Golgi's was Giuseppina Pastori. When Gemelli was the director of the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology, he asked her to be the director of the Cattolica Laboratory of General Biology. In her words, those long hours of meticulous work in the laboratory, after lessons, in the evenings, during the holidays, in the hours stolen from rest, from sleep, from free time, did not weigh him down. So enthusiastic was he about his research. His reward was found under the microscope. An irresistible fascination emanated from the secret of life. That enthusiasm for microscopic observation was never extinguished in Father Gemelli. Even while he was rector, and 1,000 cares were competing for his time, he would find a minute to escape to his laboratory in search of a beautiful specimen to observe and savour. Gemelli's knowledge of German, deepened during his novitiate, was to be a valuable asset, since it was the language of the biological sciences at the time. Close contact with luminaries in German laboratories helped him cultivate a similar scientific and cultural approach. In 1907, he studied at the Laboratory of General Physiology, directed by Max Verworn in Bonn, and later at the Laboratory of Neurology, directed by Ludwig Edinger in Frankfurt am Main. In 1911, after specializing in histology at the University of Louvain and being awarded a doctorate in philosophy from the same university, he dedicated himself entirely to experimental psychology. At the University of Turin, he attended lessons held by Friedrich Kiesau, a student of Wilhelm Wundt. Between 1911 and 1912, he specialized in psychology with Oswald Külpe in Würzburg and Bonn, and in psychiatry with Emil Kraepelin at the Nervenklinik in Munich. He frequented the laboratory directed by Karl Stumpf in Berlin, where he had developed a keen interest in sound waves. He met Karl Bühler many times, and in December 1913, he took the exam to be able to teach experimental psychology under the direction of Friedrich Kiesau, and he was awarded it in June 1914. In 1914, he declined the offer from Tokyo University to teach a course in experimental psychology. In 1927, he took the exam to become a full professor of psychology, and the reports he received are testament to his extremely high scientific profile. For example, from Louvain, "I think that the personality of Father Gemelli and the universal scientific reputation he has gained are sufficient guarantees to which a public exam would add very little, it being impossible to find evaluators who possess such fame or greater competence than that of Father Gemelli himself. At most, they could be peers from the scientific point of view." From Paris, "I believe that a public exam would be totally superfluous for the nomination of a man who presents such eminent qualifications in the application for such a post." Gemelli became a military doctor during the First World War, in charge of selecting pilots, and he's considered the pioneer of aeronautic medicine and psychology. In 1935, he transformed a plane, the Caproni K-310 Libeccio, into a flying laboratory for physiological behavioral experiments with pilots. These are the most intense years of his medical scientific research, which led him to gain a pilot's license, as can be seen in the photo taken in 1939, together with the famous pilot Arturo Ferrarin, who'd taken the first flight from Rome to Tokyo. From 1929 to 1934, he had 5 years of constant work in order to install some unrivaled equipment. This included microphones, amplifiers, oscillographs, recordings on disc or film with sound, labiographs, laryngographs, electric filters, and a kymograph. And in 1937, he installed an electronic voltmeter, an electronic tonometer, and an automatic frequency analyzer, which he then presented in Ghent and Zurich. Gemelli's laboratory of experimental psychology, which was one of a kind in Italy, was equipped with tools that were the envy of eminent Italian and foreign scholars. Particular interest was shown in the sonograph after the Second World War. Professor Samuel Fernberger, director of the School of Psychology at the University of Philadelphia, wrote in an important American journal of psychology that Gemelli's laboratory contained more tools and equipment, particularly for electronic recordings, than in any single North American laboratory. Divided between physiology and medicine, phonetics struggled to find its place among the disciplines dealing with language. It was the powerful tools of the technological revolution that led to its renewal. Starting in the 1930s, Gemelli took up the baton of phonetic research in Italy and launched himself with determination into this singular scientific adventure, soon appearing at important international congresses. At the 1938 Congress in Ghent, which turned out to be decisive for the development of phonetic sciences, Gemelli emerged as one of the protagonists, and on that occasion launched his university in Milan as the seat of the next Congress. After 2 decades of dramatic silence, in 1957, the Conseil permanent du Congrès international des sciences phonétiques, chaired by Roman Jakobson, chose Università Cattolica for its first major post-war conference. During the post-war period, Gemelli took part in congresses in Italy and abroad, dealing with experimental psychology as well as phonetics. And he published widely on the voice in national and American, French, Dutch, Swiss, and German periodicals, as well as being active in various academies and scientific institutes. Gemelli was part of an international network of scientific contacts around the world. The Cattolica archives hold many letters, witnessing to correspondence with scholars and phonetics laboratories from all over the world, including Paris, Vienna, Hamburg, Berlin, Bonn, Munich, but also Jena, Amsterdam, London, Istanbul, Chicago, Johannesburg, Lund, Helsinki, Prague, and Montreal. These letters exchange scientific and methodological information and show plans for study visits to Gemelli's laboratory in Milan from Louise Kaiser, Elise Richter, Saver Popp, Petar Guberina, and Bertil Malmberg. Often, these letters are part of a stable correspondence, for example with the eminent German psychologist Karl Bühler, who was forced to leave Austria because of racial persecution, his wife being of Jewish origin. Gemelli exchanged letters with him for nearly 30 years, between 1923 and 1951. As early as 1934, Bühler dedicated his work on the theory of language to Gemelli, and in 1951 wrote to Gemelli from Los Angeles, "You personally and your school of psychologists have contributed with so much success to defining human creativity." Among the many scientists with whom he corresponded regularly, we can think of Louise Kaiser, the Dutch phonetician and secretary of the Conseil permanent international des sciences phonétiques, who was known for her work on prosody and emotions, and a manual of phonetics published in 1957. Gemelli wrote to her between 1932 and 1959. Between 1933 and 1940, he corresponded with the Jesuit Jacques van Ginneken, a linguist and psychologist and professor at the University of Nijmegen, and between 1930 and 1937 with Annibale Stefanini, a physicist and linguist working on vowel synthesis. Gemelli also corresponded with specialized companies, Italian, French, German, and American companies, which all manufactured voice analysis equipment. The letters in this part of the archive concern the purchase, construction, or repair of equipment. One can note in particular correspondence with the K Company, responsible for the sonograph. There is also a section of letters that show his institutional commitments, with letters to international bodies, such as UNESCO, or the Canadian Committee for Reconstruction, as well as orders for the constant updating of the library. By 1973, there were over 500 pieces of equipment in Gemelli's laboratory. Unfortunately, most of these instruments have gone missing. In the permanent exhibition set up by the High School of Psychology in Cattolica, about 20 are on display, some of which were applied to the study of the voice. For example, the kymograph, the lever stimulator, and wire recorder. One of the striking features of Gemelli's career is how innovative he was from his position at the edge of academic linguistics as a psychologist, listening to the human voice. He was committed to advancing the fields of phonetics and phoniatrics through his laboratory work, and thanks to the international network he created up to 1938, which was then destroyed by the Second World War. In 1950, Gemelli founded the Bulletin of the Italian Society of Experimental Phonetics, Biological Phonetics, Phoniatrics and Audiology. It became the flagship publication of the society that he refounded with the same name. Some of the milestones in his career were the foundation of the university in 1921, the creation of the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology in 1924, and in 1926-27, the establishment of the course of experimental phonetics in Milan. Gemelli's publications amount to more than 2,000 titles, among which about 100 are dedicated to studies of the voice. There are two major works on the voice. In 1934, he published the volumes The Electroacoustic Analysis of Language with University Publishing House Vita e Pensiero, and in 1950, the volume The Psychological Structuring of Language through Electroacoustic Analysis. Gemelli's works were reviewed many times in international journals. Here is an extract from one by the Austrian psychologist Rohracher. It is a joy to study these two volumes. They give an exhaustive idea of the results obtained by Gemelli in the field of language analysis with the most modern technical means, on the basis of extraordinarily rich data, including hundreds of syllograms. Part of this material is published in the second volume, in a technically perfect way, on 88 double plates, several of which reproduce the oscillograms of entire words and sentences. The reproduction on glossy paper is so successful that the originals have been perfectly replaced by the illustrations. His research focuses on the totality of the human person and on language as an expression of all psychic life, which is conceived in the wake of Humboldt as an activity and not a product. In 1939, Gemelli summarized his work in the journal Sapere as follows: "Human language is a plastic and faithful instrument for the expression and representation of concepts and states of the spirit. The task of electroacoustic analysis of the variations that give language this aptitude requires time and patience, and the collaboration of the psychologist, phonetician and linguist, each from their own point of view. The methods of electroacoustics not only allow us to reproduce sounds with great fidelity, so that the morphological examination of the curves allows us to detect the existence of the laws that govern the structuring of language. These methods, thanks to the electronic voltmeter, frequency analyzers, the recording of the pitch of various sounds, the analysis of overtones, the determination of their relative intensity, also allow us to realize the enormous plasticity of human speech, thanks to which every phonetic variation takes on the meaning of a signal that, if acoustically perceived, acquires a new value of transmission and representation of a certain something by the speaker. We can summarize the main steps of Gemelli's phonetic research as follows. From 1929 to 1937, there were the first technical installations, from analyses of the structure of elementary units of language, vowels and consonants, to the continuum of speech and the laws of perception. In 1935, he took part in the debate around the nature of the phoneme in London. Between 1937 and 1940, he worked on identifying the links between linguistic variations and individual variations in language, and on prosody, accent, intonation, and pauses. Between 1940 and 1950, he was concerned with physiology, specifically the action of the vocal cords during phonation, and on the psychological structuring of language. Whereas between 1950 and 1956, he contributed to the study of the singing voice. In this regard, he analyzed the voice of three great tenors, Miguel Fleta, Beniamino Gigli, and Jussi Björling. Among the works studied by Gemelli, we find Divin Souvenir from Pescatore di Perle, sung by Beniamino Gigli, and O teco almeno corro a morir from Il Trovatore, sung by Jussi Björling, as well as some of the phrases from the Carmen Romance by the tenor Miguel Fleta. In August 1943, the university was bombed, and after dissemination and destruction, we find reconstruction. So between 1943 and 1945, his laboratory was dismantled, and in 1943, the instruments and library were stored in Terrazzano on the outskirts of Milan. During this period, Gemelli suffered from intellectual isolation and bitterness, but he did not give up his work. Between 1940 and 1950, he studied the working of the vocal cords in the phonation process and the psychological structuring of language. Both works are noted by Husson at the Sorbonne in Paris. In 1950, the K sonograph was marketed. In 1951, his laboratory was considered the best laboratory in Europe, whereas between 1950 and 1956, Gemelli dedicated himself to studies on the singing voice. In 1958, he received an honorary doctorate in science from the Université Laval in Quebec. His famous phonetic research was cited among the motivations for the honor. 1958 marked the peak of his celebrity and worldwide recognition. As previously mentioned, it was planned that the Cattolica, Gemelli's university, should be the venue for the first major post-war conference on phonetic sciences. This is how Louise Kaiser, secretary of the organization, referred to the event. Fortunately, in his 80th year, Professor Gemelli still has the energy to supervise the organization of a congress. This will not only unexpectedly overcome the difficulties we have encountered, but moreover, it will give us the opportunity to honor one of the most notable phoneticians. However, it was not to be. In January 1958, Gemelli had to take up another commitment that he could not refuse: the Congress of the Italian Society of Psychology. Thus, the long-awaited International Congress of Phonetic Sciences could not take place in Milan the same year. It was held 3 years later in Helsinki in 1961. Agostino Gemelli died in Milan on July 15th, 1959. He acquired undisputed authority through his scientific works and his presence on the international research scene. It is not surprising that the first chair in experimental phonetics in Italy was created at Università Cattolica at the beginning of the 1950s. It was won by Luigi Belgeri, who had studied in Grenoble, and was the author of the work Les Africains en italien et dans les autres langues européennes. Unfortunately, he died 1 year before Gemelli in 1958, and the chair was not renewed. Today, the Laboratory of the Psychology of Communication at Cattolica carries on research on the voice of emotions. Agostino Gemelli's dream was to create in his own university a multidisciplinary centre of experimental phonetics with the contribution of specialists from different areas: anatomy, physiology, electronics and statistics. This dream was realised in 1970 in Padua with the creation of the Study Centre for Research on Phonetics, sponsored by the national research body. In the following years, phonetic research developed in laboratories all around Italy, besides Padua, in Turin, Rome, Naples, and Calabria. There is no doubt that Gemelli, endowed with exceptional physical and intellectual energy, combined uncommon strengths in analysis and synthesis, and was ahead of his time with his research. As his Parisian colleague Husson said, director of the Laboratory of General Physiology at the Université de Paris, "You are already immortal because of your works." Agostino Gemelli's interlocutors frequently expressed sentiments of admiration, deference, and the highest respect. If we are here today talking about his passionate research into the science of language, it is because Gemelli defied time and the vicissitudes of life, and his works made him immortal. The history of this university and its founder are written on fascinating pages of research that can be truly considered as pioneering. It was our intention to witness to this in the centenary of its foundation.